fire back.
All right, good morning. We're going to be starting off in Matthew chapter 22, and we're going to be talking about the parable of the wedding feast this morning. I want to start us off in verse 1. And Jesus answered and spoke to them again by parables and said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who arranged a marriage for his son, and sent out servants to call those who were invited to the wedding, and they were not willing to come." Well, it's St. Patty's Day today. Who all's going to a big party tonight? Who all wants to go out and just tear up the town? You know, if I said let's have a huge green beer St. Patty's party tonight, who all's in? You know, usually if a lot of times we get invited to things and don't necessarily really want to do it. There's a lot of things that are fun that we do get invited to, but there's, things like that just don't sound appealing to me. I remember I used to be big on hitting the bars and stuff, and at a certain point in my 30s, I thought, this is miserable. It's exhausting. I don't want anything to do with this. But a lot of times, just even the most basic thing, if somebody says, "Hey, do you want to go out to dinner or whatever?" If there's a lot going on that day, I might think, man, I don't want to do that. But there's other times when I, would love to. But sometimes we're invited to things and we just don't have that desire to do it. Maybe we've got so many other things going on, or things that are more important that day, or maybe we just don't feel up to it. But Jesus is comparing the kingdom of heaven, and he's continuing in his rebuke of the Pharisees. He's talking about the kingdom of heaven and comparing it to a situation where a king set up a marriage for his son. He sent out the servants to call those who were invited to the wedding, and they were not willing to come. Now, in Jewish society, the marriages were a little different than what we see today. There were a lot of arranged marriages, and generally what would happen is the parents of the groom and the parents of the bride would make the arrangements to have this arranged wedding. They would draw up a contract. And a lot of times what would happen is that would be the first time the bride and groom would meet, was at this signing of this marriage contract. And at this point, once this happened, they were technically considered married. But they would then separate until the actual time of the ceremony. Now, during this waiting period, the bride would remain with her parents, and the groom would go off to prepare a home for the family. And sometimes this could take quite a while. But when the home was all ready, the groom would return from working on this home, and he would return for his bride. And at that point, they would have this marriage ceremony, and this wedding banquet would follow. But a lot of times there wasn't really much, if any, notice of when this was going to happen. And it was one of the most joyous occasions in their lives was this wedding banquet. And it could last for up to a week. So here this king has arranged this marriage for his son, and there's this huge, massive event that's supposed to be so joyous for all these people, and nobody cares. Nobody wants to come. I mean, when we hear about things like royal weddings on TV, there's a lot of people that I don't personally really care one way or the other, but a lot of people are really excited about it. And I bet if just about anybody was invited to go to it, they would probably want to go to it. So it seems strange that this king is preparing this amazing feast and banquet and ceremony for this wedding, and nobody cares. He sent out servants to invite them, and they just weren't willing to come. So sometimes we don't want to do things that we're invited to, but sometimes we're on the other side of it, and we invite people to things, and nobody wants to come to them. I've thrown a lot of parties in my day. There were times when nobody showed up. There were times when a lot of people showed up. There were times when I held random get-togethers that everybody canceled at the last minute. But when that happens, or when you're waiting and not too many people are showing up, you tend to put out feelers. Hey, you guys coming? Hey, I got a brisket on the smoker. Come on, let's get over here. You're trying to get people to come to them. And that's what this king does. Verse 4. Again, he sent out other servants, saying, tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fatted cattle are killed, and all things are ready. Come to the wedding. He's trying harder to get people to come to this. And if you haven't picked up on it yet, this king trying to get people to come to this wedding is God trying to get us to come to him. And Jesus came with that invitation, and so many people turned it down. So many people were just not willing to see him for what he was and who he was. They weren't willing to follow him to this banquet. Verse 5, but they made light of it and went on their ways, one to his own farm and another to his business. And the rest seized his servants, treated them spitefully, and killed them. So they ignored this invitation. They went on their way to their monotonous, to the day-to-day, to their temporary things. And how often are people just unable to be bothered with following Jesus, unable to be bothered with accepting this invitation from God because they're preoccupied with things that don't matter? I remember when God was drawing me back to, I was saved when I was younger, but at a certain point he was drawing me back to church and back to him as I started getting older. And one of the things I remember about that is there were so many of the unimportant things in life that were holding me back from that were trying at least to hold me back from that were holding my attention, that were pulling me more toward them than toward him, because my focus was so strongly on them that I was overlooking him. At a certain point, I knew Jesus growing up my whole life pretty much. But at a certain point when I was a teenager, that wasn't as cool with everybody, and I wanted to impress the friends more than I wanted to impress God. And it becomes a mindset of wanting to keep my attention on things that are temporary rather than the eternal. And that happens so much with people today. They may like the concept of God, but they're temporary, meaningless things that have such a hold on them that they're not willing to accept this invitation. And so much so, it's gone beyond just ignoring the invitation at this point. These servants are being killed. And this is a good representation of what happened then. Look at what happened to the prophets. Look at what happened to John the Baptist, to the apostles. They were coming to invite people to this wedding. They were coming to invite people to this banquet that God had prepared for them in eternity, and they were despised. They were ignored. They were martyred. And sadly, that still happens today in some cases. Verse 7. But when the king heard about it, he was furious. He sent out his armies, destroyed those murderers, and burned up their city. And he said to his servants, the wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Therefore go into the highways, and as many as you find, invite to the wedding. So those servants went out into the highways and gathered together all whom they had found, both bad and good. And the wedding hall was filled with guests. Israel rejected Jesus. Not all of them, but largely they had rejected him. And throughout time, they had rejected God repeatedly. And at a certain point, he moved beyond them and started inviting the whole world. He started inviting the Gentiles. He started inviting those who weren't normally his people. The invitation's open to the whole world at this point. And while a lot of people struggle to see the value in that, we know it. We know the value of it. We know they may not know how badly they need Jesus, but we do. So am I getting out there and am I inviting people to this wedding? I'm not going up to him saying, hey, there's this fatted calf ready for you. But there are so many things that people don't understand that we just need to reach out to them with. Verse 11. When the king came in to see the guests, he saw a man there who did not have a wedding garment. So he said to him, friend, how did you come here without a wedding garment? And he was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, bind him hand and foot, take him away, and cast him into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This sounds pretty harsh, doesn't it? I mean, if you're here at this wedding and somebody comes up and taps you on the shoulder and says you're not wearing the right thing, like what? I mean, this doesn't even sound like a biblical concept. We tell people, come as you are, and he's saying you can't be here because you're wearing the wrong thing. But what is he really talking about? Is he talking about physical clothes? We learn from Scripture that these garments are symbolic of righteousness. And these garments were given. The king would have given these garments to the people as they arrived at the wedding so that they had what they needed. A garment is symbolic of righteousness in Scripture, and even in Isaiah, it describes our righteousness, our self-righteousness, as filthy rags. It says that we are all like an unclean thing, and all our righteousnesses are like filthy rags. Our own garments aren't going to get us to that banquet. Our own righteousness isn't going to get us anywhere. It's only by the garment that's given. It's only by the righteousness that's given through Christ. And it has to be washed by his blood. In Revelation, that mentions a pure white garment, which is symbolic of pure righteousness, of Jesus' righteousness, that we can be clothed in. He says, after these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes. Verses 13 and 14. Then one of the elders answered, saying to me, who are these arrayed in white robes, and where did they come from? And I said to him, Sir, you know. So he said to me, these are the ones who come out of the great tribulation, and washed their robes, and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Jesus offers to give us those cleansed garments, just as the king would have offered those wedding garments, the proper garments, to be present at that feast. Jesus offers us the cleansed garments that we need to be seen in his righteousness rather than our own. It wasn't that this man was too poor to have the right clothes to be there. It wasn't that this guy couldn't afford a tux. It's not what this is saying. It wasn't that he was lacking. It wasn't that he didn't have the ability to wear those proper garment. It was just that he refused the garment that was offered. Our own righteousness, our own filthy rags, they aren't garments that are allowed at the wedding. It's only the garments that are given of Christ that are worthy. And those only do us good if unlike this man, we don't refuse them. It's something we have to accept. I mean, look at his reaction here. It says he was speechless. He said, how did you come here without a wedding garment? And he was speechless. Why was he speechless? He was probably a little bit in shock. When it's like being somewhere you're not supposed to be and somebody comes up and gives you a little tap on the shoulder to boot you out. He's probably a little bit in panic. Especially he's at this royal wedding and the king himself comes up and gives him a tap and says, hey, what are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here. He didn't have a word to say. He was speechless because he was probably in shock, and it reminds me of those words that we never want to hear. Matthew 7:21-23, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. And that's kind of what this guy was experiencing. It's interesting that this passage immediately follows a warning from Jesus about wolves in sheep's clothing or garments. People who are wearing these false garments. But the man was speechless. How speechless would you be? How speechless? I can't imagine how much my heart would sink if I ever experienced this. The shock that would bring to the system. Verse 14, for many are called, but few are chosen. God, the Bible says God's desire that everyone should be saved. And he will draw us to him. He will call us. We have a choice whether to heed that calling. We have a choice whether to accept those garments. Many are called, but few are chosen. It doesn't mean that God's only picking a few people that he wants to come to heaven. That's not what it's saying when he says few are chosen. But when we accept those garments, when we accept that calling, we become the chosen. We become the elect. John 14, verses 1 through 4, Jesus said, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And where I go, you know, and the way you know. What does that sound like? Jesus is going to prepare a place and to come back and get us. What would the groom do in these situations? He would go and he'd prepare the home and he would come back for his bride. And we know that the church is the bride of Christ. Jesus saying this would have been significant with the people listening. They would have understood this concept of a groom going and preparing a place and then coming back. And Jesus is this groom that's going to be returning for his bride, for the church, for his people. And that's what we're awaiting. He says, I will come again and receive you to myself. But it doesn't say when. Just like these brides, just like all the people waiting for this wedding banquet, we don't know when that groom is finished preparing the place and coming to get us and take us there. They didn't know in advance when the groom was coming and when the party would start. And neither do we. So when we feel God drawing us with that invitation, we have to decide whether we're going to receive that wedding garment. This gift of righteousness found only in Jesus. It's not just about us, though. As those that have been invited, we're to invite others. We need to pass this forward. God wants a packed house at this wedding. I heard a saying recently that I really love, and it said, "Let's make heaven more crowded." That should be our goal. Nobody wants to go to an empty party. Nobody wants to go to an event and no one else is there. I'm so glad that somebody wanted me to be there, enough to tell me, enough to pray for me. Are we doing that for others? Are we sharing these invitations with others? We don't want to let anybody miss out on this party.